Okay, are we ready? Matthew 17. Who would like to read that for us?
I can go.
Okay.
6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make us 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He replied, "Elijah is indeed coming and will restore all things, but I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him. But they did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. When they came to the crowd, a man came to him, knelt before him, and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. The disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you." As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. On the 3rd day he will be raised." And they were greatly distressed. When they reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" He said, "Yes, he does." When he came home, Jesus spoke of it first, asking, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others?" When Peter said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the children are free. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, and when you open his mouth, you will find a coin. Take that and give it to them for you and me."
Okay. What jumps out at you at chapter 17?
Yeah, there were a few things. I mean, for one, there's the man who brings his epileptic son to Jesus saying, "I first tried your disciples and they couldn't help him, but still need to get help for my son." I mean, he has a clear need, and Jesus got very frustrated, either about the need or about the disciples' inability to cast out the demon, which the Jews took care of, but just Jesus getting a bit frustrated about how much longer do I need to deal with you guys?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting point that just because Jesus, quote, empowers us to do what he does, doesn't necessarily mean that we could just go out and do it without, I often hear that from, had a conversation with somebody about healing and how Jesus would heal people, and the disciples healed people after Jesus left, and sort of like where that's part of supposed to be our birthright. And I said, well, I don't see Christians healing each other. And I think it's actually our lack of awareness of understanding how this works to assume that just because you're a Christian that you should be able to do this. There's a readiness within ourselves, a preparedness, a getting in line with God, and a probably practicing that would help do some of these good things, right? So I'm wondering if Jesus thought he had prepared his disciples to be able to cast out demons, but there was something in them that wasn't ready to do it. They were too immature, they couldn't do it, and he was frustrated by that, either their lack of belief in themselves or something. There's definitely an education, a preparedness, shift internally that has to happen for people to be able to do certain things.
So do you think even now, like, that some people could just heal with their hands if they really believed they could through Jesus?
I don't quite know how that works, but I
Yeah.
think that just, quote, believing it, there's been so many people who thought they could and they couldn't.
Right.
I
But it also is like, I want to have the faith that small, I guess, the mustard seed,
yeah.
that someone could do that. But yeah, I don't know.
One thing that worries me about that passage, of course, is that there's been a lot of, and one thing that this passage helps me with, too, is knowing that there's been a lot of damage done
Yes.
Yeah.
through faith
I
healing.
know.
Not always intentionally. Where if someone tries to heal and fails, sometimes then that destroys their own faith. They say, well, you must not have enough faith, so you terrible person. Or the person who failed to be healed, sometimes they're blamed for their failure to
Right.
be healed. It's
Exactly.
because of their lack of faith.
Exactly.
Or you should have been healed if you have enough faith. So then they'll pretend to have been healed or believe they were healed and go out pretending, feeling that they were healed, but they're actually still sick and they're getting worse. And there's just so many layers of ways it can go badly wrong. And sometimes it's kind of nice to have this reminder that the disciples weren't
couldn't do
able
it.
to heal. And if even they couldn't, so maybe it was kind of a cautionary thing. Don't assume that you're going to be able to do this every single solitary time, or maybe not even consistently, or even occasionally.
I think from a literal point of view, if we're taking this story literally about healing or casting out demons, this is interesting in that it exactly says that just because you think you should, again, how many people have refused medical intervention and just tried to get everybody to pray for their sick person, and then that person dies, and well, whose fault was it? The people who didn't pray hard enough, or the person who got sick, right? It gets
Yeah.
very dicey and weird. But from a metaphorical point of view, if you think about possession as being, there's a sick spirit within you, and the only thing that can cast the sick spirit out is a spirit of love and healing. And the disciples aren't fully embodying that yet. They're not fully out of that world yet either. It's like I use the word detox, that we're all infected with certain spirits of racism, misogyny, white supremacy. It's in our culture. And we're trying to hopefully detox from that.
Yeah.
And with that, then we invite more of a spirit of love and compassion. And there's something to seeing some of these stories as metaphorical too, meaning
Yeah.
there's an added layer to them. That there are people who are possessed, they're oppressed by all of the forces going on in the world. And Jesus is coming to release oppression. And the disciples aren't fully prepared to release that oppression, maybe because they're still stuck in it themselves. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. I also thought that it could go kind of well with what you said in your sermon today, too, about the disciples misunderstanding, thinking that, oh, we'll get this great power, this
Yeah.
temporal power. And here, maybe they were thinking, oh, we'll get these great superpowers.
Right.
Maybe that's missing the point.
There you go. I mean, I will say I've worked with people who I do believe have gifts of healing. But it's not the lay on your hands, you can stand up and walk type thing. Like a couple years ago when I was on my sabbatical, I went to he's a massage therapist, energy healer, like all these different names, right? And I was like, sure, I want to go see what I can do. And at the time, my knees were killing me. This was before I realized that gluten was probably the cause of that. But my knees were killing me all day long. And so I told him about it, and for an hour, he worked on and massaged my knees, and that whole rest of the week I had no pain. The pain slowly came back because I didn't know the root of it, but that was amazing to me. It felt like a small miracle. So he had some gifts, but he wasn't necessarily going to override my system. So anyway, that's just my thought about
Cool.
that. Some people do have gifts, but he works on it too. It's his job. He does it all the time.
So the transfiguration, what's the bigger meaning behind that? I've never really understood it. Like, why? And why Moses and Elijah? I mean, I know they were important, but I don't know. I just don't.
Yeah. I feel like it's such a metaphorical story. It's never been my favorite either. But Moses represents the bringer of freedom
Okay.
and the giving of the law. And Elijah was just, in that culture, he's the bomb. He was like the best. I don't think we get that so much as Christians, but at the Passover they leave an empty table for Elijah to come. Like, he was the best prophet ever, and they
Okay.
loved him. And so Jesus is getting advice from and in some ways embodying both of their ways. And the fact that they can see him and that Jesus kind of shines is sort of revealing who he really is inside.
Okay.
So,
And maybe even like the completeness. I was just thinking as you were talking, the three.
oh yeah.
Like first we have Moses, then Elijah, and then here comes Jesus to complete the circle.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, 18. Christy, do you want to read?
Yep. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Occasions for stumbling are bound to come, but woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into the hell of fire. Take care that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it, more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the 2 of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He said that once before already.
Yeah, he said something very similar.
Yeah. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay what you owe." Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Yikes.
Ooh, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matthew's intense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What chapter are we in now, please?
We just finished
18.
18 and we're
18.
Starting towards the beginning about putting the stumbling blocks in front of the little ones, to me is a huge indictment that basically, if you spiritually abuse someone, that is a huge, huge deal. And we were just talking about this at council, that there is a new term that people are trying to understand called institutional trauma.
Yep.
And
Same
it's a strange trauma that they can't identify as similar to other things, that it acts sort of like PTSD, but it's
It is
what I
different.
call post-traumatic religious disorder. But people who've experienced long-term loss of trust from the institution of a church that they were taught to trust. So it is when leaders do, whether it's abuse of a member, or financial abuse, or even just what I would say spiritual abuse, where you demean people and you threaten people, and these are someone you're supposed to trust and someone who's supposed to represent God, and they present a very horrific and damaging hypocritical side. It's no one event anyone can put their finger on. It's a long-term kind of frog in boiling water type of thing. And so this warning that Jesus has, it's sort of like, as you go out and be my stewards in the world of this message, you have to be very careful with the vulnerable ones and the ones who are coming to you, who are open and trusting. That's a huge responsibility to allow them to potentially be hurt or abused, or it's just
Yeah, the little one metaphor just totally resonates with me, having little kids. Like, I mean, it's just like a little kid. They're
Yep.
completely trusting in you. And it's so easy to take advantage of that. And yeah, it's despicable.
I'm thinking of a line that more conservatives use. Come with an issue, and the pastor will say, "Well, you got to get your heart right with God first." And the person who's being troubled by whatever the issue is doesn't have a clue what the pastor's talking about. Really. And this idea, you got to get right with God. Well, what does that mean to get right with God?
yeah,
And how will that help the issue?
yeah.
Like if the wife is being beaten up by the husband, well, get your heart right with God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it's like, it's
Yeah,
easier
but-
said than done. It's gonna
yeah.
be as if you don't know what
Yeah.
that looks like.
And maybe I'm stereotyping or whatever, but I've just heard it too many times.
I've known someone who used that line with me and would not give any explanation of what that meant. No guidance of any kind. Just,
Okay, so it was actually used on you.
Yeah.
All right. And they probably didn't know what it meant itself, just
I
like
don't
what,
think so.
you remember, anybody remember, they were at the CPAC convention, they asked, what does woke mean? Because they're always talking about woke this and woke that as
Oh,
a
right.
It
criticism.
was used as a way of shutting down an argument.
Yeah,
basically.
and they
Okay.
don't know what it meant. They all had different ideas of what it was supposed to mean. And so what I'm getting at is even in spiritual things, I can have pat Bible answers.
Yeah.
and you're not there. You don't know what I'm talking about. But you'll be quiet because I'm supposed to know and you're supposed to listen or something like that. And yeah, many years ago, I can find it again. Many years ago, when I was in Graham, I found a website that was for recovering Baptists. They had everyone in that website had been more of a condensed or firm Baptist approach to life, and they were trying to figure out their liberation, what did it mean to be Christian, and so on, trying to recover. The recovering Baptist. I laugh about it, but it's true. And yeah, so you touched a nerve with me, that's why I'm saying so much.
Yeah. I think it also, if we're using the term little ones, that implies that we're supposed to be adults. We're supposed to be grown-ups. We're supposed to be mature. And with that maturity and power comes the responsibility to protect the little ones.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge responsibility to hand to anyone who considers themselves a leader, is do not let the little ones be hurt.
One thing that is interesting about that is we got all of these really powerful and often visceral reminders of why this is important. But sandwiched in the middle of all this is, if your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut off or throw away. That little bit there, verse 8 and 9, that gets used often to justify really important punishments on people who are straying.
Yeah.
They're saying, well, we're going to make you do all this penance because you've got to go back onto the straight and narrow, because the punishment will help you.
Yeah.
Because it's better for you to suffer all these punishments than go to hell.
Yeah.
There have been some really nasty. You go back in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, you see a lot of it there, but even to the present day, there's churches that have put people through terrible things.
Yeah.
With this as the justification.
Yeah.
That it's worth it if it saves you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't save them. It
Yeah.
makes them hate it more.
Yeah, that's one of the sad things. You cannot make anyone believe anything necessarily, and you cannot also make anyone change.
Yeah.
You can manipulate them and control them, but you can't make anyone change. And so if somebody is doing something wrong that's harming the community, you can bind them so that they're not continuing to harm the community, but you can't make them change their heart. You can only create the fertile ground for it, but it's up to them to decide what to do. Again, take care of yourself first instead of using this as a way to have power over others. So it's meant to be introspective of what is causing you to stumble in your own life, and take responsibility to fix that. Yeah.
It is also very difficult, being responsible for children. Again, I'm thinking of you do get to a point where sometimes you realize am I doing what's best for them because it's best for them, or is it now about power and control? Mm-hmm. That's so hard, where I find myself getting into this where I would just do it because I said so, because you get so frustrated.
Yeah.
And it's yeah. So anyway, as any leader, I can see how it's very difficult, to not cross that line of it becoming more about you being in control than actually doing what's best for them and taking care of them.
Then tell me if I did wrong. Downstairs, the children were not willing to get along. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't even agree on what song to sing.
Of course not, no.
And so on. So I said, I want to be the good dictator, and I want to tell you what song to sing.
Yeah.
Okay, but I also owned up to it. And then I, somewhere along the line, about 3/4 were at the end, why is it so hard to get along? And so...
Mm-hmm. Well, because they all want to be in control, too. They want to pick the song.
Yeah, and, some people are pointing at each other and so on. I just tried to stop them for what to reflect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're all learning power and our worth, and it's so messy. It's so messy. You know, and I do think that a lot of times the Christian message is we're not supposed to have power versus saying there's nothing wrong with power, it's how you use it.
The ones who said that were ones in power.
I know.
That's the irony.
I mean, I don't know if I said that very clearly. It was usually white men in power who were determining that pride and power and privilege were wrong, and then they'd use that against women and people of color who had no power, right? Who were already had low self-worth. And then they were praised for it, and it kept them in their place. And that is infuriating.
Yeah. It's just a whole irony. The one who told us that, they're in power.
Yes. It worked out nicely for them.
Yeah.
Moving on to the handling of conflict in the church and the forgiveness piece. It's funny to use the word church. Jesus would never have used the word church. So this is where we get an idea that yes, the people writing down the gospel were putting some concepts in Jesus' mouth. There was no idea of the church when Jesus was alive. So Jesus wouldn't have said, if one person, go talk to them. If two people, then bring them before the whole church or whatever the word is.
Community?
Yeah, that just doesn't make sense.
What would they have called the synagogue? Like, what? I'm just trying to think. What was their concept of a church body, or wasn't it really like that?
I think Jesus was showing something different. It wasn't organized at all quite yet. Something outside of the.
Because the Jewish tradition wasn't really that. It was more there, right? There was a high priest, and you went to the synagogue, but there wasn't so much a body of believers, really, right?
Yeah, it wasn't as solidified as we think. When we think of Jews now, it's a very specific faith and religion. And if we went back in time, while they had temples and priests and they had synagogues, we're not even sure how much of the Passover Seder meal was even the same. They could not know what the heck is going on if you took one person back in time and switched them out. So, but be that as it may, this is still a really good advice that came from the faithful community of Matthew, and this is very rarely used. As I've seen, that if somebody has wronged the community, to have one person try to speak to them privately, calmly, and then if they don't listen, to bring another person and then to kind of bring them before the council or the congregation. And if they're continuing to be a harm and they will not listen and they're continuing to be a harm to the community, it takes an unbelievable amount of courage and calmness and maturity to act this out. And I've more often seen it where people with bad behavior are just allowed to continue their bad behavior because nobody wants to stand up to them.
I was through this at Transfiguration back in 1985 or 86, whatever the year it was. And Bishop Chilstrom, we called him president.
Can you speak a little louder? Sorry, sometimes it gets...
Bishop Chilstrom, we call him bishops now, but he was president of the synod because there had been accusations made against the senior pastor. And we went through this process, and there was a similar kind of process, and we had 3 weeks of open meetings where there was bishop representatives. You could come and meet and tell your story, either good or bad, about the pastor. And that went on for 3 weeks, and eventually then we had a gathering in front of the whole congregation. And so it was a similar, but Bishop Chilstrom kept referring to this as the guideline for how we were doing things. That it had come from particular members, and some members thought they were. I remember here's the thing where friends get involved, where one person it's hearsay, but he had been relatively good friends with Dr. Chilstrom at another level. And he was one of the accusers. And he was one of the group that wanted the pastor gone, period. Rather, the pastor wasn't gone, wasn't asked to leave directly. He was allowed to stay with these changes. So it wasn't, so there was a change expected, okay? And he did those changes. But I also know that's when he began his process looking for another call. It
Yeah.
took a couple, 3 years to go to a decent parish that he wanted to go to rather than having to get out of there. You follow me? And that was still a strain of the congregation. But the point is to actually experience it somewhat.
Yeah.
And there was correction in that case.
Yeah.
And then it took about, see, I was there for 13 years, and I would suggest that the congregation was just beginning to heal when I left. That's, you know, a good 10 years later, roughly, more or less. It's hard in the congregation, you know, no matter what happens.
Yeah.
But you may be aware there's been cases where the whole staff has been asked to resign. Because there's such division between, like, let's say if I was assistant pastor here or something, or associate pastor, and we had such a tension going on here, and we had gathered the troops of members behind us. Those who like Pastor Sherry, those who like me, and all that kind of stuff. And then that was our fight.
Right.
That's happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that.
And then the whole staff was told, you will resign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because this congregation is to start over, and then they bring in pastors with special gifts to try to
Yeah.
affect healing. It's just tough on the community.
Yeah.
No matter what happens, it's still tough in the community. And yet it's better to try to have a positive process than just an all-out war
Yeah.
and allowing things to go on. I'm not saying we should allow things to go on.
Yeah.
But it's hard to deal with because
Yeah.
Well,
Healthy processes are hard for us because many of us just don't come from healthy backgrounds. And so
yeah,
we're used to dealing with things in unhealthy ways, and it's vulnerable to have to go through a healthy process where you have to, rein in your ego or, share something. It's difficult.
yeah.
I want to just move on to the forgiveness piece here in the interesting parable about forgiveness. I think forgiveness is very misunderstood in our world. So often, as many times as people say it's not this, people believe forgiveness means you're saying it's okay, that what happened is okay, and even that you're going to be in relationship with the person who hurt you. And that's not true.
Right.
Forgiveness has also been likened to, it's a poison you drink hoping the other person will get sick, right? So, and while there's some truth to that, I do think it would be worth a deep conversation on what forgiveness is and human relationships, because you can forgive somebody and say, I'm never going to see you again, because they're not going to change. They're going to keep hurting you. It is not your job to be abused by somebody. That is not righteous, to be abused by somebody and to continue to forgive them. Rather, to me, it's that idea that there's an acknowledgement that what that person's done to you really actually wasn't about you. It was about their own insanity. It was about their own version of reality they were living out. Because if they were perfectly sane, they would not have hurt you intentionally, and if they knew about that, they'd immediately apologize, right? So that is a sane world. A sane world is, I say something flippant, it hurts your feelings, you tell me, I apologize because I don't want you hurt. That's sane. An insane world, which is what we're living in, is people who either intentionally inflict harm or inflict harm and then when confronted about it, gaslight and all those other things, right? So to me, the best understanding I've heard is we forgive people by realizing that they're not their full good selves. They're not acting out of their highest self. It's not about me, it's about them. However, I can still do this job here of talking to them individually, bringing in another person, and then eventually you know, if it doesn't go well, they're not invited back into the community. So it's right next to that. So forgiveness has nothing to do with allowing bad behavior to continue, or that somebody says, in fact, a pastor had just written about this on a pastor forum saying, you know, we had a member of the council who did something very, very inappropriate and hurt people. And so we asked that person to step down from their position, and she's mad because we're supposed to be forgiving. And that is a very manipulative comment, because it's again saying, oh, Christians are supposed to be forgiving, meaning you're supposed to say it's okay and let behavior continue. Absolutely not. And in fact, I think that the parable here illustrates that, because this man was forgiven his debt, but he refuses to forgive others. So he doesn't understand that there is a relationship, that debt and forgiveness and all of this stuff, there's a relationship going on. And because he refuses to be changed, he ends up being removed from the community. So Jesus is by no means saying that by forgiving someone 77 times, it means you just let them continue doing what they're doing. Because this person had a consequence, which is to be removed from the community because of the harm they were doing.
I mean, the way I look at debts, I mean, forgiveness is much in the context of forgiving someone their debts. You acknowledge that, yeah, there was this debt, and I'm no longer expecting it to be paid. I know you can't pay it, or you won't pay it, or whatever, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to turn around and lend money to you again. I mean, depending on the circumstances, it may or may not, but it certainly will influence my willingness in the future to continue the relationship of friendship or the debt. It's just that I'm no longer expecting this debt of the payment to be fulfilled. Similarly, if someone has wronged me in some way, like dinging the van with the bicycle, I mean, I know that that's not going to be paid. It was a bad situation. Just let that be in the past. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm just going to let it happen again either.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the parable also brings to the reality that we've done so many actions throughout our own life that have been harmful to others and ourselves. And yet God, we're constantly forgiven because God understands completely where we're coming from, that we're scared and we're lost and we're confused and we're ignorant and we're all of this. God gets it. Can we understand that enough about ourselves? That God has given us full forgiveness because God understands how much in some ways we are still like a lost child, right? But so is everybody else. So if you can't turn around and give that same gracious perspective to other people, you don't get it. You don't actually get that you have been forgiven. And that goes back to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those. Because as much as you've been able to receive forgiveness of God is the same amount you're able to give it. And if you can't give forgiveness to anybody else because you love to lord it over, well, you know, I'm just better than them, you don't get who you are.
That's how to show appreciation for the gift. Pass it on.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus uses really harsh language in here.
Yeah, like the have him be tortured until he'll pay his entire debt.
Yeah, and this is unique to Matthew, and part of it is the way they'd use phrasings in Aramaic, where they'd say things really strongly to get the point across, but they knew it wasn't supposed to be literal. It was just a very striking story to wake you up. And I wonder if Jesus was speaking to us today about what was going on with us, what images would he use? What parables would he use? What language would and wouldn't he use to try to get our attention? versus what he used 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I've read the 77 times thing as a figure of speech. It just means an arbitrarily large number.
Yeah,
It's until you lose count,
Yes.
yeah,
is essentially what that means. And I've also listened to what you said, and we can say that because we're not biblical literalists.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the branches of Christianity that are biblical literalists and say, no,
Yeah.
we can be harsh, we will be harsh, right? Because we can say so right here. Yeah. you follow me?
Tell yourself I'm nuts that way, though.
The biblical literalist. And yeah.
yeah.
So I'm not trying to argue against what you said. I'm just saying this we can say what we're saying because we're not literalists. We're trying to gain deeper understanding. We know that truth it means more than just the facts, surface facts,
Yeah.
things like that. But it's just hard in today's world. Yeah, I shouldn't say.
It's hard in any work. In the past.
Yeah, but I mean, I believe I'm a faithful Christian in my own way, but there's others who would say I am not.
Yes, there's who will say anyone is not being a faithful Christian or a faithful follower or believer of God, including the Pharisees pointing to Jesus Christ himself, saying that he was not a faithful follower of God.
Yeah. And
I mean, there's always going to be the naysayers, those who are going to try and make themselves look better than everyone else.
yeah. Irony of life.
I was reading in one of the books that said if you're reading through the Gospels and you never put yourself in the shoes of the Pharisees, you're not taking this seriously. If you never use your biblical imagination to realize how we may be more like the Pharisees than we are the woman asking for the crumbs off the bread of the table, right? And I thought that was a really good point of view, that when we listen to the stories, almost all of us put ourselves in the shoes of the person being healed or the disciples.
Victims.
We forget that we're in this room historically the ones who are in power and in the church, therefore we are the Pharisees. And so it's an interesting awareness of, that's why we need to listen to people who are traditionally disempowered to kind of help us correct our sight.
That's true. It's often embarrassing. I often feel embarrassed when I read some of these stories. Like, that's me. I would do that. I know I would do that.